The following is a presentation of VBR. Welcome, and thank you for joining us in our study of God's holy word.
Welcome to Video Bible Reading Series on Second Timothy. In this segment, we're going to introduce the book. We're going to talk a little bit about the author, the book's recipient, talk about the circumstances under which the book was written, and then have a few things to say about the major thrust of the book. Before I get into any of that, however, I would like to make a couple of preliminary remarks. And the first of those is that this series on 2 Timothy has been designed to serve as a standalone study. 2 Timothy is a sequel of sorts to 1 Timothy. It's written by the same man to the same man who's living, it appears, in the same place, dealing with some of the same circumstances. And because of that, there is a certain amount of overlap, not a great deal, but a little bit. And in preparing these presentations, I had a decision to make. When I come to some of those places where the two books overlap, where they're dealing with the same thing or the same person, do I just refer the viewer back to a video on 1 Timothy, or do I just go ahead and cover that material in this series? And I opted for the latter. I think that will allow for greater continuity, and it'll allow anyone viewing this to not have to go back and forth and deal with the trouble of doing that. Secondly, before we get into this study, I want to acknowledge my indebtedness to three authors whose work on 2 Timothy was of benefit to me in my preparations for these presentations. The first of those authors is a man by the name of John Phillips. He wrote a book entitled Exploring the Pastoral Epistles. The other two men jointly authored a book. Their names are Tremper Longman III and David E. Garland. The book they authored together is called The Expositor's Bible Commentary, the Revised Edition, Volume 12. I admittedly do not agree with these men on a number of essential doctrines. Nevertheless, I did find their research and observations on 2 Timothy to be frequently useful, and not infrequently I have incorporated some of their material into these presentations, sometimes even borrowing language verbatim. So if in the course of this series you hear anything that seems to be particularly pithy or memorable, there's an excellent chance it was drawn from one of those books where they are addressing the passage that we're studying at that moment. So with all of that out of the way, let's jump in to the book of 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy was written by the Apostle Paul. He identifies himself at the outset of the letter, as was customary in his day. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 1, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ. And in verse 2, he tells us to whom he was writing, to Timothy, a beloved son. Now, even though we have two books in the Bible that bear the name Timothy, those books are not the first time we meet Timothy, and they're certainly not the only time we meet Timothy. All the way back in the book of Acts, chapter 16, Luke, the beloved physician, tells us about one of Paul's encounters with Timothy. And I'd like to go ahead and read the first three verses of Acts chapter 16. Then he, that is Paul, came to Derbe and Lystra. And behold, a certain disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a certain Jewish woman who believed, but his father was Greek. He was well spoken of by the brethren who were at Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted to have him go on with him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in that region, for they all knew that his father was Greek. Now there are a number of interesting and important pieces of information we get from these three verses. First of all, Timothy was the son of a certain Jewish woman, we're told. Luke doesn't tell us her name, Paul does. Right in this very book, 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5, Paul says her name was Eunice. And Luke tells us Eunice was a believer. Timothy's mother was a Christian. But Luke says his father was a Greek. And he offers no additional information. And the implication of the silence is that Timothy's father was not a Christian, nor was he a proselyte to the Jewish faith. What his faith was, if he had one, we don't know. But Timothy was the product of a spiritually mixed marriage. And that can be hard on a child. When you have conflicting and confusing messages, Mom and Dad, both of whom love you and you love, both of whom you trust, are telling you different things. But Timothy seems to have come out of that in a good place. What trials he might have gone through in getting to that place, we don't know. But despite his father's unbelief, Timothy himself was a committed Christian. He was, according to Acts 16, verse 2, well spoken of by the brethren who were at Lystra and Iconium. And if we couple verse 2 with verse 1, we get possibly a little hint as to Timothy's city of origin. Paul and Silas in verse 1 encountered Timothy when they came to Derbe and Lystra. In Acts 16, verse 2, we're told Timothy was well spoken of by the brethren at Lystra and Iconium. Lystra is repeated, perhaps indicating to us that was his hometown. Whatever the case, he had a good reputation in these cities. Both men in the Bible who are specifically identified as evangelists, now they're not the only evangelists, but the two who are specifically identified as evangelists, Timothy and Philip, are both said to have had a good reputation. Timothy's called an evangelist in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 5, and that's worth noting, by the way. As you may have noticed in the book written by John Phillips, he calls 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus the pastoral epistles, and that is a very common designation for these three books. The broad world of quote-unquote Christendom regards Timothy and Titus as pastors, but the Bible does not so describe them. Timothy is called an evangelist. And although the work of an evangelist and a pastor can overlap at times, they are very distinct offices. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11, they are listed separately. Christ ascended into heaven and he gave gifts to men, and among those gifts were apostles, prophets, evangelists, and then pastors. Distinct offices. Timothy was not a pastor. He was an evangelist. And he had a good reputation. So did Philip. Philip's called an evangelist in Acts chapter 21, verse 8, and in Acts chapter 6, verse 3, we're told he had a good reputation. Any man who would serve as an evangelist in the 21st century must have this quality that the evangelists of the first century had. He must have a good reputation among the brethren. Timothy had a good reputation, no doubt, because he was a man of moral integrity, but probably also because he had done good work among these brethren. And I'm led to believe that simply because in the third verse of Acts 16, Paul wanted to have Timothy go on with him. Paul would not have wanted someone to go along with him in his work if that man had not already shown himself to be a worker. Paul could say that he had labored more than all the apostles. He would not have wanted a man to come along with him unless he could count on that man to work. If you want to get something done, you need to find somebody who's already getting something done. Paul believed that Timothy could be trusted to work, and furthermore, he apparently believed that Timothy could be trusted to continue to work. Paul had had a bad experience with John Mark. On the first journey that Paul had taken out of Antioch with Barnabas, they had taken John Mark with them as their assistant, and when they had gotten to Pamphylia, John Mark had left them to go to Jerusalem. The Bible doesn't tell us why, but Paul did not find the reason very compelling, because when it came time to go on a second journey and Barnabas was ready to take John Mark along, Paul said, "No way." And in Acts 15, verses 37 through 40, we find that Paul and Barnabas had a sharp disagreement about this. Barnabas felt strongly that John Mark, his cousin, ought to be given another chance. They would go along, but Paul would have none of it. Paul wanted to know with absolute certainty, at least as certain as you can be in this life, of things not related to the Lord, that he was taking a man with him whom he could trust would stick with it. So Paul would not have asked Timothy to go along with him if he didn't believe that Timothy was that kind of man. So that's pretty high praise coming from the Apostle Paul. Before Timothy left with Paul, however, we're told in Acts 16, verse 3, that Paul took him and circumcised him. He circumcised him because the Jews who were in that region knew that Timothy's father was a Greek. The Jewish rabbis taught that a Jewish woman should not circumcise her child without the consent of the father. It may well have been that Timothy's father, being a Greek, a non-proselyte, non-follower of the one true and living God, saw no reason for his son to be circumcised and therefore had not been on board with Eunice's desire. Whatever had led to that, Timothy found himself, as an adult man, to be someone of Jewish descent, but one who did not bear the sign of the covenant. This would have been an insuperable strike against him in trying to preach the gospel to the Jewish population in that region. Anyone who didn't even bear the most basic, the sign of the covenant, was clearly not someone to be trusted as credible in religious matters, or so the people would have thought. So, Timothy allowed himself to be circumcised, either directly by Paul or had Paul bring him someone who would circumcise him. And there's a lesson here. Timothy clearly didn't have to be circumcised. It had nothing insofar as his own salvation was concerned. But if he was going to be successful in preaching the gospel, he was going to need to be circumcised. Sometimes things that aren't technically necessary become practically necessary if we want to be effective in our service to God. Paul talked about this in 1 Corinthians 9:22. He said, "I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some." What Paul preached in 1 Corinthians 9, he was called Timothy to put into practice in Acts 16, and Timothy did. And it was a sacrifice. Remember all the way back in Genesis 34, verse 25. The men of Shechem had agreed to be circumcised as adults so that they could then intermarry with Abraham's family. We're told in Genesis 34, verse 25, on the third day, they were in such pain that Simeon and Levi could march right in and kill all the men without any fear of sufficient resistance. So incapacitating was the pain for an adult man on the third day who had just been circumcised that they couldn't even protect their own lives. Timothy willingly went under the knife for the sake of the gospel. It speaks volumes about his commitment to God, volumes about his love for the lost, and that decision couldn't have done anything but further endear him to Paul. And Paul did regard Timothy dearly. Right here in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 2, Paul calls Timothy a beloved son. Now, Timothy was not the only person who Paul regarded as a son. Paul calls Titus a true son in our common faith in Titus chapter 1, verse 4. He calls Onesimus my son in Philemon, verse 10. He referred to the congregation at Corinth, 1 Corinthians 4, 14 and 15, as my beloved children, and told them that he was a father to them in that he had begotten them through the gospel. Still, it seems apparent from the remainder of the evidence we have in the Bible that Paul felt fatherly toward Timothy in a special way. And I say that because from what I have been able to find in my studies, Timothy is the only individual whom Paul referred to in this way repeatedly. Paul calls Timothy a son twice in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 2, chapter 1, verse 18. He calls him a son twice in 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy 1, 2 and 2, 1. He calls him my beloved son, my beloved and faithful son in the Lord in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, 17. And then in Philippians 2, verses 19 through 22, where he gives glowing praise to Timothy, he again refers to him as a son. Paul, a man who never had any children of his own as far as we know, and who regarded many with fatherly affection, does seem to have found in Timothy a special son, if you will. There was a special relationship. He felt a closer and deeper bond with Timothy, one who was very like-minded. Perhaps the relationship between Paul and Timothy versus Paul and other men was a little bit like Jesus and John versus Jesus and the other apostles. There was something special there. Paul loved all those others, of course, but there was something special between him and Timothy. When Paul wrote this epistle to Timothy, he was not in a good place, at least with respect to his physical circumstances. When he had written 1 Timothy, He was in Macedonia, it appears. He had to leave Ephesus, where he had been working together rather quickly because of the riot that's recorded for us in Acts 19. He'd gone into Macedonia, and then he had written to Timothy thereafter. In the case of 2 Timothy, Paul is in Rome, and he's a prisoner. In chapter 2, verse 9, he says, I suffer trouble as an evildoer, even to the point of chains. Now, Paul had been a prisoner in Rome before. That's recorded for us in Acts chapter 28. On that occasion, he had been in chains, Acts 28, verse 20, probably chained to the soldier who guarded him, Acts 28, verse 16. But he had been able to stay in his own rented house, and he'd been able to receive all who came to him, Acts chapter 28, verse 30. He was under house arrest. And that imprisonment had been one from which he would eventually be freed. And he had anticipated being released. When he had written to Philemon in the book of Philemon, verse 22, he told Philemon, meanwhile, prepare a guest room for me, for I trust that through your prayers I shall be granted to you. No imprisonment is enjoyable, and it always comes with considerable hardship, particularly first century imprisonment in which you would be in chains. But that first imprisonment had been different from this one that Paul was now experiencing, because Paul knew now he was never going to be released. When Paul wrote 2 Timothy, he knew not only that he wasn't going to be released, but he was expecting to die. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 6, he says, I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure is at hand. Timothy, he was saying, I'm not long for this world. That not only colored what Paul wrote, but it ought to color our reading of it. Because when a man is dying, his mind is focused on the things that are important to him. We're getting a glimpse into Paul's heart here. The things that are important to him as he's getting ready to leave this life. That gives weight to his words. Paul's in prison in Rome. Timothy does appear to still be in Ephesus, just as he was when 1 Timothy was written and received. Ephesus and Asia, that is the Asian province, what is today Western Turkey, are both brought up in the letter. In chapter 1, verse 15, Paul says, this you know, that all those in Asia have turned away from me. Why bring that up to Timothy unless it was relevant to Timothy in some way? Chapter 1, verse 18, Paul says, you know very well how Onesiphorus ministered to me at Ephesus. Again, why bring it up unless it was somehow relevant to Timothy's situation? Furthermore, in the 4th chapter, verse 19, Paul tells Timothy to greet Priscilla and Aquila. Now, Priscilla is listed there with a short, an abbreviated form of her name, Prissa, but it's the same people. Paul says, greet Priscilla and Aquila. Well, where were Priscilla and Aquila? Paul had left them at Ephesus in Acts chapter 18, verse 19. And then finally, Paul says in chapter 4, verse 19, to greet also the household of Onesiphorus, the very man who had ministered to Paul in Ephesus. So we've got a considerable amount of evidence there to support this conclusion that Timothy is still in Ephesus. A few general remarks before we close. By this time in Paul's life, he had already written 9 church letters, possibly 1 general letter, if he wrote the book of Hebrews, and 3 personal letters. He'd written 1 Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. As far as we know, when Paul finishes this letter, he finishes writing altogether. When he puts down the last amen at the end of 2 Timothy, he puts down his pen forever, as far as we know. He's already been brought before the Roman emperor once. He references this in chapter 4, verse 16, when he speaks of his first defense. He's already seen the face of Nero. He's now waiting to see the face of Jesus Christ. This second letter to Timothy is significantly different. Although there is a certain amount of overlap, it's significantly different from the first. The first letter had been occasioned by Paul's sudden departure, and he was writing back to Timothy so that Timothy, the young evangelist, would know how to handle the work in Paul's absence. He talks about how to find qualified men for the office of elder and deacon. He talks about how church money ought to be spent. In the unlikely event that accusations were to rise against an elder, how to handle them. In 2 Timothy, we don't get things along those lines, at least not very much, if at all. What we do get is Paul reminiscing, talking about his ancestors, chapter 1, verse 3, talking about Timothy's predecessors, his mom and his grandmother, chapter 1, verse 5, and then Timothy's instruction when he was a child in chapter 3, verses 14 and 15. There's a lot of sentiment here. It's the way we would expect someone to talk to a good friend when he's getting ready to leave the world. Paul's love for Timothy and his desire to see him one more time, it really jumps off the page. In chapter 1, verse 4, he says to Timothy, I'm greatly desiring to see you, that I might be filled with joy. There are a lot of things in my life that aren't very joyful right now, but seeing you would give me reason for joy. In chapter 4, verse 9, he tells Timothy, be diligent to come to me quickly. Later on in the chapter, in verse 21, he says, do your utmost to come to me before winter. Paul wants to see Timothy one more time. Why does he write this letter? Just to get Timothy to come see him? No. He is getting ready to leave this world, and he's leaving Timothy behind. Second Timothy seems to be written, in part at least, to stiffen Timothy's resolve, to prepare Timothy to keep the faith and continue contending for the faith after Paul is gone. Paul talks in this letter about the hardship that he's enduring right now. Chapter 1, verse 12, chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, and he goes on to repeatedly reference the hardship that Timothy needs to be willing to endure. In chapter 2, verse 3, he says, you therefore must endure hardship as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. In chapter 3, verse 12, he says, yes, and all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. And that's going to include you, Timothy, is the clear implication. Chapter 4, verse 5, he says, you be watchful in all things, endure afflictions. Why does Paul keep hitting on this? Because he is about to go. And Timothy is going to be there without Paul to lean on, without Paul to look to for encouragement. And the Roman world's growing more hostile towards Christianity. The false teachers are gaining influence. Timothy's going to have to face it all without any help from Paul. And Paul wants him to do it with steely determination. He wants Timothy to have his eyes on the prize. And so he writes this book to encourage him. We're going to see things in the first chapter where Paul is in essence saying, I believe in you, Timothy. He writes this book to encourage him, but also to instill in him some additional resolve. Because he's going to have to walk alone. That is, alone leaning on the Lord. It's a lesson that all of us, if we live long enough, have to learn somewhere along the line. We've all, no doubt, who are Christians, have had someone in our life that we felt like we could lean on to kind of help boost our faith, if you will, point us in the right direction. But somewhere along the line we find that we can't always look to someone else. The only one we can always look to is the Lord. One brother told me that he's passed from this life now, that when he was a young man, he entered the military. I don't know if he was drafted or not, probably was drafted, but he entered the military during World War II. And he found himself among people who were not trying to encourage his faith. And he found himself overseas in a foreign land. But he told me all these years later, he said, it was good for me. He says, I learned to walk alone. And to a certain degree, that's what Paul was telling Timothy. I'm about to go, Timothy. I'd like to see you one more time. But whether I do or not, be strong in the Lord and in the power of His might. That's Paul's message to Timothy, and that's 2 Timothy's message to you and me. We'll end our introduction there and look forward to jumping into the text of 2 Timothy in the next segment. Hope you can join us then.